Okay, I am back again for Odinmade Hero, the programming series where I learn how to make a game from Handmade Hero by Casey Muratori one day at a time in the Odin programming language. Now, yesterday was a pretty great way to start the week. It was a relatively easy day for code, and I didn't have any seriously show-stopping bugs. We added this notion of the player entity having a sword, which we can now kind of drop on the ground there if we press one of our action buttons, and it's not really a sword. You can see it's looking a lot more like a rock. So like I think of it more as like we're going to implement this rock throwing attack so that we can do damage to this disembodied torso here. So that's what's on the menu today. We'll just jump right into it because there's nothing particularly exciting that came up. Although there was one little rant that Casey went on during the Q&A. Somebody mentioned like an article that somebody else had written kind of critiquing his compression-oriented programming paradigm that I don't think he really even talks about anymore. At least I haven't seen him talk about it in so like specific a term. In some of the more recent stuff I've seen him do in interviews and just other talks he's given on the internet. I think because, and I'm just assuming here, it could be because it's such a prescriptive term for his programming style as he sees it, but then people start arguing about like the semantics of what that even means, and it's just not very productive. At least it's my take on it and how he probably feels about it at this point. But he went on a rant about that critique that was leveled against this idea of compression-oriented programming, and the critique was basically like, what if you compress incorrectly? And then he said something to the effect of like, well, we can't all be the Usain Bolt of running. You know, some of us just suck at running. So you have to get good at compressing your code by practicing a lot, you know, and training or, you know, refining, like being very critical of yourself in not letting yourself get away with doing really dumb things with code. Like I had this experience last week. I looked at some code that I wrote a couple years ago. And a couple years ago, I wasn't totally green, but I had like 3 years of experience at that point, 3 or 4. And I knew better than to write this code as poorly as I had written it. And so I've set out over the past couple weeks to start not completely redoing it, but certainly improving it dramatically and with very little effort. Like I could immediately see this is terrible and I know exactly how to make this better. And that's something that only comes from experience and seeing enough bad code and seeing enough good code and writing enough good and bad code for yourself to where you can tell the difference. So it was just kind of funny hearing him go on that little spiel about that. Like, yeah, you're not going to just intuitively, you're not going to have an intuition about how to compress your code correctly right out the gate. There is no prescription for that. You can't follow a set of steps. Like some of this is because not every single problem looks the same, right? You're going to come across unique problems over the course of your coding career or whatever it is you do, right? And it's on you to get good. Like the responsibility lies squarely with you to be accountable to yourself and the things that you do. And that applies to a whole lot more than just code. So that was just fun to hear. There wasn't anything else that stood out, or if there was anything else that stood out, his little rant about that was the most interesting thing to me. So we'll go ahead and keep on learning. I had the window muted, so that's not good. Unmute that, and today we'll start implementing projectiles. So let's go.
Everyone, and welcome to Handmade Hero, the show where we code a complete game from scratch, live on Twitch, no engine, no libraries, just us in here writing every little last piece of code so that after this series is done, literally we have done every single piece of code that is necessary to run a game from top to bottom. No mysteries, leaving no stone unturned. That is our mission, our goal, our charge, if you will. Now, we're trying something here today that is new. I don't know if it's going to work. We'll see. But basically, like, we have switched to Mischief for the Blackboard. And what I did is I went ahead and got the commercial version, and I'm starting a fresh Blackboard, and I'm just going to save it to the directory and see if this works for people who can load it up at home. The problem that I see with it is we were unable to figure out any way to really get this to work so that people could view it with a free viewer, and I still don't think that's going to be possible because I tried using the free version of Mischief, but the free version of Mischief doesn't even let you set a background color for the canvas, and so people were very sensitive to the colors. I remember when we first started it, people really wanted to have a dark background so that it would match the editor that we use, so it wouldn't be kind of like very jarring when they switch between them. So I'm afraid we got to go with the commercial one. The commercial one's only 25 bucks, so if people want to view the art file, they can choose to buy it. I don't know, it might load in the free version, we're not sure, but we're just going to go with it as an experiment. We don't really have any other choice at this point. What I can do periodically to solve the problem is to do some kind of an export where I could save it out to an actual bitmap file eventually, but this thing's gonna get so huge, I don't know how likely that's actually gonna be. So we'll see. We're gonna go with this for now, because it's the best solution that we found. I can't say it's perfect, but that's basically where we're at. So, with that in mind, and starting today, we'll see how that goes. We can talk about it in the forums again, see what happened after a couple days. And again, that file is now going into, in the Handmade, well, if you have pre-ordered the game on handmadehero.org, right, you have access to the source tree. That source tree, that same zip file will now have inside the MISC directory, there'll be this blackboard.art file, and that blackboard.art file will hopefully contain all of the drawings that I do on the stream now ad infinitum. So there we go. All right, let's see where we're at. If I remember correctly, and programming all day and then coming home and programming on the stream, I gotta admit, I don't always remember where I was in Handmade Hero because I have a lot of other programming that I have to do. But if I remember correctly, what we were doing is we were using a rock bitmap to basically have a virtual sword for our guy, and we wanted to make the sword be something that he could use to basically attack, another entity. So really basic stuff was all we wanted to do, and I think we just did the part where we took the sword and you could basically drop it, like that's it. And so what we wanted to do now is we wanted to finish that off so you could actually kind of throw the sword Zelda style, and when I say sword here, I guess I mean rock because we don't actually have a sword bitmap. Probably should check something like that in at some point, but we are not going to at this point because we don't have. So we want to go ahead and make it so you can kind of throw that there and make it into a valid, projectile that actually makes some sense. So we did most of the work yesterday, I think, for actually doing that. We might as well just go ahead and get that working today, right? So one thing you'll notice is it's kind of ridiculous now when we drop the sword. Like, the whole point was not to drop the sword. The whole point was to throw the sword. So what we should probably do is go ahead and go in there and and make that stuff a little more sensible now. All right. So let's take a look when we actually did our sword stuff here. This is where we actually put the sword into a location, right? Here's how that worked. And what we'd want to do, presumably, because we're actually making the sword occur, we're making the sword appear here, we probably want to go ahead and give it a velocity, right? Because that would be the easiest way to make it sort of sail across somewhere. So if we wanted to, we could make it have a velocity by moving it into the high entity set and setting its velocity equal to something, equal to the direction that you threw it in, and that would make it travel. Now, again, the other thing that we said is we might want to make the sword only go a certain distance so that you can't throw it infinitely far. It will only go a certain distance, or maybe it like hits the ground, so maybe it kind of gets thrown in an arc. I don't know. We'll have to think about that. But point being, distance remaining, we kind of put that in there just to see if we could sort of initialize that to some number of meters, however far you could throw the sword. So I want to go ahead and put that in as well, right? So first things first, let's go ahead and set the controlling entity's distance remaining. Sorry, not the controlling entity, the sword entity, right? Which we have here. Let's go ahead and make that sword entity have a distance remaining, and let's just say that it's going to be, I don't know, 3 meters or something like that. Maybe that's too short. We'll say 5 meters. And so as soon as the sword has traveled 5 meters, we'll just say that that's as far as the sword gets to go, and that's the end of it, right? And so the sword, at that point, we could also say, let's go ahead and set its velocity. In order to set a velocity, we have to have it in the high entity set. And so one thing that I could do here is, excuse me. One thing that I could do here again is force it into the high entity set. We didn't do that yet because there wasn't any particular reason to do so, but it seems like now there actually is, right? And so what's kind of weird about this, and you can sort of see the way this is going, is kind of annoying. Again, sorry, I have a cold, so I'm still sniffly today. Believe me, it is no fun for me either. Anyway, the thing that I haven't been liking very much about the low entity, high entity thing, although it's been working relatively well for us in terms of how it's actually functioning, the code is kind of annoying because you constantly have all these weird like pointers and indices, and I don't love the fact that there's so much typing involved there. I don't like the sort of proliferation of that. And so what I'd like to do is finally maybe get it down to the point where it's something that's fairly condensable, like it's something that doesn't have to have so much kind of jankiness there. And so I went back and forth with using this entity structure, and what I'm wondering is if maybe we kind of need to just get that that sort of thing to be more standard, right? Maybe just kind of figure out what the calls need to be where this entity actually happens, and then actually start using it. Because again, like the same thing's going to happen here, right? We're going to have like a high sword or something like this, or here's low sword, right? If I do it this way, and then I've got the sword, and I go force entity to high, right? It just there's 2 pointers to the sword, or 2 things. It just it just is kind of ugly and annoying, right? And so far we haven't really hit bugs because of it. For whatever reason, it just doesn't seem to be error prone, but it results in too much typing, and it makes the code harder to read, and that just is a constant drag on development. So it's just flagged in my mind as something that we need to address going forwards, because I just don't like it, and I'm not going to be willing to have that stay that way forever, basically, right? So yeah, so let's just assume that we're going to deal with that, and we'll think about it, keep it in the back of our heads, and just.
Okay, so I wasn't sure if he was actually gearing up to just make that change right here and now, and maybe he will. And damn it, I muted the video instead of pausing it.
The direction we want to go in, right? So all we
Great. How hard is it to keep a video from getting... Let's see, did that move? Did that mess everything up? Did that mess up the format of the thing? No, I don't think so. How hard is it to just pause a video? Seriously. Okay. So yeah, I wasn't sure if he was... Oh man, my eyes are on fire because of this really cold weather that we have now. And the fact that where we live is super dry in the first place. It's murder on my eyeballs. I thought he was going to make this change just because he was talking about it and ranting about how he didn't like, all this low and high business. And so I wasn't sure. And so I wasn't writing any of the things that he was writing. But basically, right, we have to say we have a low sword now until we do make that change. And over here, we set that off of that. And then over here, we have to pass in that low sword. Just go ahead and get rid of that. Pane down there. And this needs to change as well. And that should be that. And so now we go ahead and get the high sword by forcing this sword into the low entity into the high state. Now we don't have something expressly named low index, so I think we're going to have to do that and pass that in. I can feel that the code is getting what the heck? Why did this happen? Seriously, why did that happen? Jeez. I can feel that the code is getting so wide that I'm going to have to, yeah, I mean, look at this. Now we're wrapping, just trying to make this call. I'm going to have to do this and start formatting all of my code this way, because it's too much at this point. Right? Like we lose some screen real estate, but that's how OLS probably wants to format all of the procedure calls anyways. It was nice knowing this format while it lasted, but it never seems to work out. I don't know why I just default to trying to write things that way at first, but it never happens. It never sticks around. It happens because I can't help myself, and then I inevitably change it down the road somewhere. So yeah, let's see. I mean, that all looks right. I think that's good. I'm not sure how much more we have to do to make this change, but Devil said, imagine double jumping by dropping your stone midair to jump off of it. Oh man, I don't even know how I would go about doing that, to tell you the truth. Especially because we don't really have like a notion of Z being treated that way. I mean, I'm sure if I tried to do that, what? Oh, I need a comma here. I'm sure if I tried to figure out how to do that in earnest, and this of course isn't being used, so we have to throw that away for now. If I sat with that requirement for a while and tried to figure out how to do it right, like the issue is that we don't actually have like a Z height for certain entities. I think we add one at some point. But like if the entity is there in X and Y, then it's just in our way, right? Like I can't levitate over this quote unquote monster because it's blocking me in the X and Y, and the Z is not even taken into consideration. But the idea, right, would be that it has some kind of Z height where it stops blocking, and then I could levitate over the top of him. And then likewise for the rock, right? We jump, and then we drop the rock. In fact, I don't even think the rock comes in at the same Z height as the player. And we can prove that right now. If I jump, yeah, it just kind of appears underneath on the ground. So you'd have to have it pop out at whatever the bottom of the Z height of the player is. And so yeah, there'd be a couple things there, but I'd at least know how to start investigating how to do something like that. But we're not quite there yet.
You know, let's just...
I moved the window over again. Oh man, it's so painful. 3 Windows updates in like 5 days. Let's see if the next one actually fixes this full screen bug so I don't have this weird problem where I have to watch the video in like a fully expanded pop out that's not technically full screen, because if it's full screen it's frozen and I don't get a feed. It's great.
Assume that we're going to deal with that, and we'll think about it, keep it in the back of our heads, and just know that that's something that needs to get addressed at some point. So let's say we go ahead and do here, we go ahead and force it into the high entity set, so it's going to be a high frequency update, and now we want to actually set its velocity. Well, we now already have this D sword thing, which is the direction we want it to go.
Oh, because this is not, yeah, so that's not the high sword. And now we can do that, right? And then on the high, we set the delta P to be D sword, right? Something like that. Oh man, my eyes are doing it again. Oh, that is bad. I should have taken eye drops before the stream. That was a mistake.
In, right? So all we really need to know is how fast we want it to travel, what its velocity should be, right? And I don't really know how many meters per second a sword should travel. I don't know. I feel like maybe if the sword takes 1 second or 2 seconds, that seems fairly reasonable. So maybe you know it should go about 2 meters per second. I don't know. We'll tweak that constant. We'll see. But I think that if I go ahead and set that, I feel like that should allow us to see that sword, and by sword I mean rock, travel actually in a direction after we launch it. Although that was kind of unspectacular. I just realized that what we don't do yet is we don't actually have any kind of update for our actual sword. So let's take a look here. Are we actually ever dealing with this guy? Where do we actually, for our move entity call, right? For our move entity call, there we go. It looks like we are only ever, let's see, move entity. So on our update familiar call, we do move it. We don't ever have an update call for our sword, right? So the sword itself will never actually move unless I actually at some point give it, give it the actual swords and say update it, and then it can do its move entity. Now I don't know if we actually need, and this is kind of an interesting point, I don't know that we actually need a special case of updating the sword. It probably could be using something that updates generic sort of projectile-y sorts of stuff. But again, this is code that we're meant to sort of suss out how we want the entity system to work. So for now, I'm going to write everything explicitly, and then I'm going to see what things look common to me across entities and pull those out as we go, right? Again, that's compression-oriented programming. I think it's the sanest way to go at this early stage, where we're just trying to figure out exactly what we want everything to do, so we don't build our game on top of a bad foundation, basically. So I think that if that's the case, then really all we need to do for move entity, I guess now that I look at it, we don't have any acceleration for the sword. The sword stays the same speed the entire time. That's typically how a Zelda-style sword would work, right? So if I'm doing that, I think really we don't have to do anything other than call the move entity routine that we always called before. And that move entity routine should, in general, just work. Now, there's something that I got to check here. I don't know if we actually... yeah, so there's some things that we need to do in here. For now, I'm going to do it right here. I guess right... let's see, right here. I want to basically turn off collision detection on the sword for now. So what I want to say for now only, and we're going to do something a little fancier here in a minute, but for now only, I'm going to say that if something collides, then it does this testing. But if it doesn't collide, it doesn't do that testing. And that allows things like the sword that are marked non-colliding to just sail through stuff, because I want to sort of think about what's going to happen to them a little bit differently, right? So let's go ahead now and finish things off. In here, we kind of want to be able to do...
Sometimes he makes a change, and then he does something with his editor to where I just don't see where that change began and ended. I could see he started writing in here, right? Like, what is it? Entity low type, right? Or no, not type, but if it collides, then we do all of this, but... Seems kind of weird that you would still do any of this iteration to me, but maybe not. Then we go down to the bottom of this, and we know we're never going to hit an entity, I guess. So yeah, I guess the idea is that it'll just move past it. It'll move through it. That's simple, maybe.
I'm going to say that if something collides, then it does this testing, but if it doesn't collide, it doesn't do that testing. And that allows things like the sword that are marked non-colliding to just sail through stuff, because I want to sort of think about what's going to happen to them a little bit differently, right? So let's go ahead now and finish things off. In here, we kind of want to be able to do update sword, right, like so, and we pass at the game state the entity and the DT, and I think that that's most of what we would need for our sword. That was a pretty uninspiring sword throw, but I think it actually did move. But it's actually slowing down, and I believe that we still have a problem here, and in fact, this is a good time for us to actually start to pull this out, because we never actually did this with the familiar, with the familiar and so on.
Okay, so before we move on with that, I'll make sure that we can just ever so slightly nudge that that rock out whenever it dumps out, so to speak. I can't tell if that actually did anything. Hold on. Hold on. Let's try again. Yeah, barely. You can see it just moved maybe a few millimeters. So far, the hero has like 0 points in the strength perk for sure.
Still have this bad notion where the player's speed and the acceleration and the drag and all that stuff are actually just built in. And that's really kind of bad because each individual object is going to want to have its own things, like its own drag and that sort of stuff. So the reason that our sword stopped going is because our move entity just has baked into it the fact that there's always air resistance, right? Which gives him the same kind of like stopping as the player has, which is totally not what we want at all. We want the sword to just sail, right? And so in order to fix that, what we would need to do is say that these are sort of things that are parameterized when the entity is being moved. Those are parameters that control how this update actually happens, right? And so the first thing that I think we'd want to do here is make it so that player speed is no longer this kind of thing that gets multiplied, the acceleration gets multiplied by the player speed, right? That's what we were doing here. And I think that's just totally bogus. We don't want to do that at all. What we want to do is we want to say that we have some notion that the acceleration has already been processed by whoever it is that's calling us, and it is the valid acceleration for the frame, and move entity is only responsible for actually responding to that acceleration, right? So that's the first thing we want to do, right? Which is acceleration. So valid acceleration passed in. And that's pretty easy to do. We'll do that today, I think. And the other thing what we want to do is in here where we have this drag coefficient, right? We'd like to sort of have some notion that the drag coefficient was also something that's passed in, right? And since this is something that affects the acceleration, right? And it has to do with the equations of motion as well. I think we probably will want to pass in this value, the actual coefficient, so that when we change this into an ordinary differential equation here, which we'll want to do a little bit later, I think that we'd want that to kind of just be baked in here so that you can just pass in a drag coefficient, right? And so what we could do, there's a number of different ways we could do this. I'm thinking that maybe one of the easiest things to do would be have some kind of an entity spec, right? And so a move spec, something like this. And maybe, you know, the move spec has something like the acceleration and the drag coefficient, right? So this is the drag coefficient here, right? And that's going to be, you know, for the player that was negative 8.0f. So this will actually be something where we'll take the move spec. I guess we don't want it to be negative. We'll say that it's positive, right? So we'll say the move spec drag. We'll just replace that there. And then the player speed, we could make the speed be a parameter and then actually have it do this as a directional thing potentially as well. I don't know if we want to do it that way. It just kind of gives an easier way to pass in stuff than having to have it roll its own. So maybe we'll try it that way. We'll have a speed parameter as well, right? And then we'll also have a bool, which is basically like cap, or I should say unit max XL vector or something like this, right? I don't really know what to call that exactly, but basically, if we wanted to keep all of this stuff as stuff that you could use when you call move entity, and it would all be fairly common working stuff, right? Then what we could do is just say that, you know, the stuff that we were doing before is stuff you can just optionally have this function do for you, right? So if you want to make sure that your acceleration is at maximum unit length, so basically what you're doing is you're using it as a proportional scalar, like with the analog stick, like what we were doing, it'll do that for you. For the player speed stuff, it'll actually do that for you as well, right? And so this is going to be speed equals that for when we actually move that out there. So what we could do here is say that also happens, right? Move spec dot speed, and then you also pass in that drag. And now what you could do is you could have the entity, and in addition to the acceleration, you could pass in that movement spec, which is basically just a thing which says how, you know, how this entity moves, what are its equations of motion. And we could add some things perhaps later that will tune the motion as well, other things that we might want to control, right? And so now we know that if we were to make one for the player, you know, it would...
Okay, I'm sufficiently far behind, but I'm not that far behind, so I think we're just getting rid of this right here. And that new DDP is going to be calculated off of the move spec speed. That looks right. And then we apply the drag. And we only do this if that move spec, I don't know what to call it, flag is set to true. And this whole thing is going to take one of those now. And it'll be a pointer. Okay, and then I'm guessing he's just going to define this here. And then throw it down somewhere else. Like so. And then I think we're good. All of that looks to be the same. Yep, cool.
Look like this, and unit max cell vector equals 1.0, right? Or sorry, equals true. And so if we wanted to call this for the player, now we could just go ahead and do that in the move entity call for the player, right? So here's the one for the familiar, and we know that that was also using the one that the player was using, although probably it shouldn't. Probably should be set a little bit different than that, but...
Where is update player? We don't really have an update player. But over here, we can do that and pass that in over here for, what is this? This is the familiar, right? And that has to be pointer. Not sure about the sword, but he hasn't gotten that far. So, where else are we calling that? Just right here? Right, because that is for the player. So we're probably going to define that right here. I really don't know.
Player, now we could just go ahead and do that in the move entity call for the player, right? So here's the one for the familiar, and we know that that was also using the one that the player was using, although probably it shouldn't. Probably should be set a little bit different than that, but you know, we'll sort of get to that when we actually are fussing with things of that nature. So there we go. We can pass that there. We can go ahead and, you know what, we probably want to have this be a default too. We'll make this be a default move spec, something like that. In fact, I like that a lot, so we'll say that. That way we know that we've always kind of got some kind of a default there. So let's say move spec, default move spec, like so. And put one here, so we don't...
So now I need to go and define that. Wherever that should go, we'll just put it right here above all this update entity stuff. And that should be default move spec. Now if we go over here, we just call that, and then I suppose we'll do the same thing for the sword. I don't know yet. I just want to correct these errors as I see them. And then back down to where this is, where we're updating the player, we can just do the same thing. And I don't know, I mean, maybe that'll just work now, maybe not. Everything looks like it's working okay so far. What about the sword? Sword is still not sorting. That's too bad.
I don't know what the speed of the sword is exactly. I think, oh, we do. We know that the speed is 0. It can't accelerate. We know that it has no drag, and we know that we don't actually need it to do any of this stuff. So that's just completely not doing anything.
Okay, so he just... Oh yeah, I guess he did start. Yeah, he did do this part, and I don't know. My brain couldn't keep up. So, but then he just zeroes it out anyway. So I'm inclined to just say that this is actually that, right? there's no point in making that default call just to zero everything out. But in this case, it'll just do what? Oh. Okay, that's interesting. It actually keeps going, and I'm supposing that maybe because we're passing in 0 there. But it never goes away. It just kind of keeps on sliding till the ends of the earth.
So we got the default move spec there. We've got our move entity. There we go. And then we've got the same stuff going on here. So that's going to want to use basically this guy for now. There we go. So all right. So that's pretty much all there is to that. And again, I don't really know if I love that or not, but it just seemed like a sensible thing to do, just to kind of clean up what was happening in that function and kind of move it out into something that we can deal with. And so what happens here in this default one is I just wanted to make one where the default things that should happen will happen, right? So that people, if we add, basically what I want to do here is if we add members to this, because they're physics parameters, I feel like it might be too hard to do. I usually try to make it so that everything defaults to 0. But in this case, the defaults being 0 might not make sense, because in physics, some things want to default to 1, some things want to default to 0, and you have to name things in very odd ways to make that work. And so in this case, I just kind of decided, well, I'm going to go with actually having some kind of initialization here. And so basically, most people will just initialize that to the default spec, and they'll go from there. So let's just verify that everything seems to be still working. Our familiar head is still following us around, which is good. And
so he actually decides this is what the default should look like. And that means that wherever we are calling it, we actually have to update this. So this is inside of update familiar. And I guess we'll just assign, well, was that set to true? No, he sets that to false. The unit max acceleration vector thing. So now in this case, we are really just updating all of it. And overriding everything from the default. Like, we're not actually using the default anywhere, it seems. So it's not much of a default then, is it? I don't know. It's too premature to think this hard about it, probably. I think the drag was actually supposed to be 8, right? And then, so that's that. And I think this all needs to be the same for wherever we are updating the player. And now everything should be the same. Yeah. Okay.
Most people will just initialize that to the default spec, and they'll go from there. So let's just verify that everything seems to be still working. Our familiar head is still following us around, which is good. And there's our little sword, quote unquote sword. Off it goes. And so that's what we wanted to have happen. It's a bit slow for a sword. So I think, to say the very least, we would probably want to make sure that that sword goes a little bit faster in the future. So let's do that. But also, what we now want to do is go ahead and implement that thing where it can only travel for a certain distance before it goes away. And so, all right, first of all, our DP is actually going to have to be much higher than that. And then our distance remaining, what we want our distance remaining to do basically is to sort of act as like a ticker. And so what we do here, I think, is we'd say, let's take wherever the entity was, and then we'll take wherever the entity is now. So we'll just say the old position of the entity equals the entity's position at the start. And then we'll say the distance traveled equals the length of basically this vector right here. So it's going to be the entity's current position minus its old position. So that'll be the length of that vector. And then what we want to do is subtract the distance traveled basically from that. Now, there's a little bit of a bug in here.
Can I just call linealge dot length? I think so. So we're going to call the length of the entity's high position. Oh, geez. Typing is hard. Minus the old. And we're going to do that after we've moved the entity. And then that is where we will update this distance remaining member, and this should just be that, right? So at this point, well, at some point, not yet, but at some point, once this reaches 0, right, or underneath 0, because we are, and what did I say that was? Did I say that was it's a float? So once it gets into the negatives, then we essentially will disappear the sword, right?
And I'm not sure whether we want to address it now or not, but we'll talk about it in a second. The first thing we want to do is say if this distance remaining drops to 0, right? So if the distance remaining falls below if we basically used up all the distance that we have to travel, we want to go ahead and make the sword disappear, right? So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and change our entity location. We want to change the low entity index, right, for this guy. Change entity position, entity location. So like so. We want to go ahead and change its position to essentially nowhere, right? So we want to take
that actually goes over there. My function signature does not look the same as his because I don't have to pass in that arena. So we pass in, yeah, the entity index actually was first. I thought the world went in. Yeah, no, the world is first. Okay. So that'll look like that. And what was third? The actual low entity. And then the old position, like, do we care? Do we care about either of those? I wonder if we could set them to be a default of nil. Because when we pass in nil for the new position, right, it'll just set it to be null. What even is the distance remaining? I don't think we ever set that. Ooh. What is that assertion? Yeah, so for, I think this is related to what I was talking about yesterday, where there's like a bug with the sword being put into an invalid position. Well, it could be because I wrote that call wrong, actually. But that's kind of weird because shouldn't it be... I mean, old position is nil. I passed in nil. So why would that be tripping? Is it because there's another call happening? Right? I don't know. We'll see what Casey does, but this may be... It's related to the issue that I was talking about, but I don't know if it's the same issue.
I want to take that low entity, sword.low. This is actually sword.lowIndex, I guess. Why do we have... This shouldn't be sword. This should just be entity. I don't know why I typed sword. It's just entity. There we go. So we go ahead and pass that. We have its old position, which is just where it was, right? And in some sense, I don't even know why we're passing this anymore in this utility function, because the old position is just wherever it was, right? So this is always going to be entity low p, right? Is that old position. So I wonder if we should just get rid of that now. It does seem like we should. But anyway, and then the new position is nowhere, right? The new position is it's just not going to be anywhere at all. So I think that would basically do it. The only thing that, I guess we haven't done yet is we haven't made a length for our vectors. We made something that does the length squared, but we don't have anything that actually gets the length. But that's not very difficult, obviously, because if we want to get the length of something, and we already know how to get the squared length, all we have to do is square root it, right? And square rooting something that's the length squared will get us the length, right? So that's pretty easy. So we'll go ahead and return that, and off we go. Now, at this point, you may be asking, well, square root.
Very interesting. I feel like it's got to be inside of this initial call. We'll see if Casey actually has this issue. But now it's not even telling us that we're hitting an assertion, right? Like that's very bad. The sword gets disappeared and then things blow up. Yeah, very bad.
is undefined for negative numbers. You're correct, it is. But what you have to remember is, since we're calling length squared, there is no actual possible way that it can produce a negative number. Now, why is that, right? Well, the reason, because if you remember back when we talked about the math, the inner product is when you take a vector, well, two vectors, and you multiply their components by each other. So you multiply the x's by the x's and the y's by the y's. Now, normally that could produce a negative number quite easily, as long as one of these was negative and the other one was positive, and the positive, times a negative is a negative. A negative plus another negative would be a negative. That'd be really easy. You can imagine lots of ways that this result could be negative, and so you would end up taking the square root of a negative number, which is not a good idea, right? Complex numbers, not something we want to have happening in here. Because we don't even have any place to store them. We're just storing a real value, right? But you have to remember, we are taking the length of a vector, which means we're passing itself as both parameters to that inner product, which means it's going to be its own x times its own x and its own y times its own y, which means it's going to be a square plus a square. And any number squared is always going to be positive unless that number was complex to begin with, right? Any real number times itself. If it was negative, it's two negatives, so negative times negative is going to be a positive. If it was two positives, then it was going to be a positive. If it's two zeros, it's going to be a zero. So there's really no way this can possibly be a negative, because it's going to be one positive number or zero plus another positive number or zero, which means our square root essentially can never fail in this case, right? So that's easy enough, and we don't really have to worry about that too much. Of course, I guess we do have to worry about the fact that we've never actually defined our square root, which is kind of odd. We've never had to take a square root. It's right there. Did I spell it wrong? What happened? Or is it that handmade math comes after it or something like this? Square root, let's see. Let's see. Where are those intrinsics? Where is handmade math, I guess, is the more important. Handmade math. Yeah, so that's our problem. That needs to go like that. All right. So we're basically done here. We are going to have to, that's totally wrong, fix up the typos here. And there we go. Let's see, change under location converted 5 from world position. That's true, that needs to be the address of the position, and that's done. So now I think that should move it after it's done traveling, or we might get an error. So that's it.
Thank goodness. So, well, actually, did I have the assertion wrong the whole time? Was I looking at the wrong one? I thought it was, to be honest, I don't know why either assertion would fire, but let's just nil that out again. And see, so that's line 231. Yeah. It's definitely asserting on the old one, but for him, it asserted... Oh no, that's actually a totally different assertion. That's bad news for me. Unless maybe this is the assertion that's getting tripped when we do pass in the old position, which could totally be it, right? But for some reason, it's just not propagating correctly. Could not tell you why, but hopefully it's the same. It would be very strange if it wasn't, right? Like we get the same exact kind of crash at the exact same moment. It doesn't make sense for it to not be the same issue.
Interesting. We hit one of our assertions that basically says that one of the things that we were passing was not canonical. What happened there? What happened there? Change into location. So old p and new p. Oh, so I think when we wrote this function, we never actually did one for a new p being 0. So we've never actually allowed you to change entity's location from somewhere to nowhere, if you will. So basically all that assertion was telling us was, well, actually, I don't think that was assertion. That was probably actually a null pointer reference, but I could be wrong about that. I think what we actually want to do here, oh no, it wasn't assertion. What we actually want to do is just say, if both of them are valid and they were in the new chunk, then we leave the entity where it is. Otherwise, we process it separately, right? And
okay, that's easy enough to reason about. So back over here, both new p and old p have to be non-nil. Otherwise, they can't possibly be in the same chunk, right? I guess I'll just see. Before I let him progress, I should make sure that this actually gets us somewhere. So now we're still hitting this, and is valid. Yeah, like which aspect of this is it hitting? I guess I can only assume that it's not here. Here. I don't think, I mean, I guess I could check, right? Do we successfully move the sword to nowhere. It looks like we do, and this is failing, or we're hitting that assertion in a different inside of this call, but it's somewhere else where this call is happening, which I guess could be here, could be what is this? That is and the move entity call. So yeah, hard to say. I can only hope that Casey's code is still broken too.
So that's, I think we just needed to just check that there, and that should be it. I think. Let's find out. Let's find out.
Thank goodness. Okay, that is the identical assertion that I was tripping, but he didn't trip that one at first, so I was just like, what the hell is going on here?
That's a little bit odd. What are we doing? What is the actual assertion there? Old P is valid. So is it suggesting that it's not actually valid? I can't actually tell. Yeah, I want to see what it's actually complaining about. Access violation writing location 000. What exactly inside that assert is writing a location? Well, you know what? That may just be that may be a slightly spurious way that that's being reported. So let's actually step in there and make sure that we actually know for reals exactly what's going on there. So what's happening here? Let's see. Let's find out. So the new chunk P and the old chunk P, that old chunk P is invalid. So basically, this is still moving the guy after he essentially has been moved to 0. So what I guess was probably the case here, now that I think about this, is if we've moved him, I wonder if this is a case where we have, well, let's go ahead and see here. If we're actually moving somebody out and then he's still in the high entity set, so while he's still in that high entity set, he gets moved again, and then that causes a problem. I assume that's what's happening.
There we
let's
go. Yeah, that makes
find
sense.
Out, if that's the case. So we need to be in the
right.
file. So what
I was not sure exactly why or where, but he just articulated exactly the thing that I thought was happening in a later call, and then we confirmed it right when we printed out. Are we able to change the entity's location the first time? Because the next time that happens, somehow it's left in a bad state.
What we want to do is we want to see what happens at the end here when we move the entity. So the sword, we want it to disappear at this point. We go in and say change entity location. We go ahead and we change it. Everything's fine. The low entity is now outside of that set. And so our sword entity, which I want to kind of pay attention to now, let's see which one he is, right? Entity dot low index. So he's 92205, right? And we can always view him as well by just saying the game state low entities 92205, like so. There he is. And you can see that he's got an invalid chunk X, which is what we want because he doesn't exist in the world at the moment. And so that's pretty good. Now, what I suspect is happening, and I'll just say this again, because, in fact, thinking it through, I'm almost positive what's happening. So when we change an entity's location, I even put a to-do in here about this before, because I was thinking that it probably should happen. You'll notice we said if this moves an entity into the camera bounds, should it automatically go to the highest set immediately? There's a corollary to this is if it moves out of the camera bounds, should it be removed from the high set immediately, right? And basically, immediately is probably the wrong word here. We maybe don't want it to be immediate, but we may want it to happen in some kind of a more controlled way than waiting for the next time that set camera gets called, right? And so what I believe is happening here is we change this entity's location, and then in the high set, we don't actually do any work to sort of ensure that it's removed from that high set and not still getting updated in the high set as if it's still in the location that it was before we moved it, right? Because we're only changing that low P and we're moving it out into the middle, out into non-existence. That should remove it from the high set, but unfortunately it won't, right? Like there's no code that will actually do that because the only thing that removes things from the high set is when their high position moves outside the camera bounds, right? So I think there's probably a hacky, not particularly good way to solve this problem, right? And that would basically be to set the entity's high position to something super invalid, right? Like you could imagine setting it, taking that and just doing something like, you know, this kind of nonsense, right? That would probably do it for us, but I want something that's not going to be so janky, right? I want to think this through and do it in a kind of a relatively easy way. But I just want to see if that's the actual problem, is that it's not getting removed from that set. I want to see, yeah, so that's what I assumed, and that is actually the case. So that's what I expected, and so we have to kind of think about that, and this is actually a very important problem in my mind. This is exactly the sort of thing that we want to kind of look at a little more intelligently, because it's the kind of thing that you really want to get right, or you're going to have lots of subtle bugs of exactly this kind. Because having two frequencies of update for your entities is a complex thing. If you don't get the basics of it right, you'll constantly be fighting this battle of bugs like this that annoy you and waste your development time.
Well, it did solve my problem as well, so that's good. Now we can hurl rocks at the monster. Nothing happens, but I'm proud of the fact that this just worked. He had to, well, I don't think that he had to, but he had to like actually specify that he was adding you know, 1 million to both dimensions of that position vector, but I get to just do this, and I didn't have to do any extra work. Right? Thank you, Odin.
All right. So the question is, what do we want to do here? Let's review how our entity system's actually working, right? And I use the term entity system loosely, but the entity code that we have so far, right? We don't really have an entity system per se. So what we're doing is we're spinning through these high entities that we have, and we're updating them as we go. And so when we update the sword, eventually it's time for the sword to sort of get moved out of existence. And so one of the things that becomes true here is it shouldn't participate. Once it gets moved out of existence, it's possibly the case that it shouldn't participate any further in anything else that might happen on this frame or on subsequent frames. So one thing that we could do is essentially mark things for deletion or remove things as part of this loop, right? That would be the first tier way to deal with this. And the example there would be some sort of a control flow thing that tells us that, right? So you can imagine something like this, which is like remove, right? Should a high entity index get removed, right? And so we'd set that to false, and then what we do is for any of these people who have an update call, right, you'd basically have a remove call that would return to us whether or not we wanted the thing to get removed. Now, that's all right, and what we do is at the end of this right here, we just process that out. I don't super love that as an idea necessarily. I think what I prefer, I would prefer something that could set that on sort of a more in a more global sense, perhaps, something that could do it so that it'll get processed the next time through maybe on that set camera call, something like that, right? I think that's really what I would prefer. So what I want to do is take a look at that set camera call and see how that's working, right? Right now, what it's doing is it's saying offset and check frequency by area, right? That's the call that loops through and says who's still in the sort of the play field. It would be nice if that in and of itself could just check to see whether a high entity should or should not still be around, right? And it seems to me like that's a more sensible place to do this potentially. Just thinking it through, you know, something like this, where we would say, you know, if high, you know, is alive or something like this, or we could even do it a little bit more straightforward. We could say that low entity position. We could say if its low entity position is valid, right? Which I guess we don't really know the low entity position here, so it kind of bites an extra lookup, which I don't love. But you know, we'll sort of do that for now and just see. We can always put in something to accelerate that later if we want to, right? So I'll just go ahead and do low entity low, and we'll go ahead and grab that guy off of here, like so. So what we'll do is we'll say if that low P is valid. That's one reason. But if it's not valid, if the entity has moved out of existence basically and its position is in the ether, then we're not going to leave it in that high entity set. Now I don't know if that's the best criteria for now, but that's certainly stronger I think than what we had previously, and I like that a little bit better. So let's take a look at what happens there. Let's just take and its position is in the ether, then we're not going to leave it in that high entity set. Now, I don't know if that's the best criteria for now, but that's certainly stronger, I think, than what we had previously, and I like that a little bit better.
Whoops, sorry about that. All I was saying is that I really got to stop doing that. It's so difficult because I'll do it absent-mindedly. Not absent-mindedly. I'll consciously do it because I'm trying to not overload the stream with garbage noise because this is not ASMR. And, you know, I'll absentmindedly forget to turn it back off. But all I was saying is that I wanted to get caught up with where he was at, right? Which is pulling out the low entity out of the low entity set, as he refers to it. And then we check if its low position is valid. And that's literally all there is to that change. I think that's all. And then what I was commenting on is I wasn't sure if he pulled this out yet. And I mean, I think he's addressing this problem right now by doing that, so I could always test and see to see if my understanding is correct. And it looks like it is, so there you go. It kind of looks like it's going farther than it was before, or maybe not. That's just my own perspective, yeah. If I walk away from it, right, after I throw it. But I think that means we can get rid of that now. And so offset and check frequency by area. Looks good now. And then, of course, like you said, doing the extra lookup is kind of annoying to have to do just to check that, but that certainly is more elegant, and it'll handle any other situation like that we could run into. So I like it.
So let's take a look at what happens there. Let's just take a look at that. We've got one other thing that we kind of need to address when we do that, though, which is that when we're going through this loop, if we don't remove people right away, then they're still getting checked for their current location. I don't know that that's necessarily bad, but it's something to think about, right? I mean, the sword for the rest of the high entities before we get to the end of this loop, the sword is still where it was originally, which I don't actually know if that's a bad thing, but it's something we have to think about. All right, and so I think that's also, so you can see that also solves the problem just fine, right? Our sword still seems to be incredibly slow, which is odd, and I don't know why that does not seem to have gotten any velocity either. That was particularly weird, if I do say so myself. I'm not sure why our sword would ever not have velocity. How did that happen?
Like I said, he didn't pull out that modifier to the high position after moving the sword into nowhere. I wonder if I can recreate that bug, though. Right, where if he just keeps spamming... Whoa. Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's definitely something... I can, like, hook shot it. Like that. That's definitely not right. But that's like a game mechanic right there, right? Where you get, like, bullet time. Curve some bullets. Curve some rocks.
That's pretty amusing. Let's take a look. D sword. We always do give the sword some velocity, right? Yeah. Distance remaining 5. It's high DP. It can't collide with anything, so it...
Yeah, I wasn't able to recreate that bug where it just kind of froze still. I mean, we all saw it, and I think I did see it a long time ago when I did all this work in Zig, but I can't recreate it now. It's not getting stuck on any of the other entities here, so kind of weird.
Shouldn't ever be able to have a velocity that's not 0, right? Because we specifically said that swords don't collide. Pretty sure, anyway, when we did add sword, right? Collides is false. So when we're calling move entity on the sword, I would think there should be no way for it to ever actually get into a state where it can't, where its velocity would get clipped, right? Because in theory, let's see, hit high entity index, it can't ever set hit high entity index, right? It's always equal to 0. So it should never actually, I don't think, be able to have a velocity that is, yeah, that is 0. So how did that happen? I'm very confused about that. That's very troubling. That doesn't seem like a reasonable thing to have happen. I want to know what I'm missing, basically, because if this always gets set, I'm trying to think if there's any other way that it could get set with the DP not being equal to that. But its DP should basically always be this. I don't know why its DP ever would be anything else. Yeah, so that's a little disconcerting. So I'm trying to think of what would be the best way to catch that error, right? Like, what's the best way to hunt down how that happened? Because it obviously happened. I saw it happen. So let's think about this. Basically, we get a low entity. There shouldn't ever really be a way. Yeah, I cannot think of a way to really have that happen. Gosh, that is really strange. Well, let's take a look here. When an entity gets forced into high, aha, there we go. So that could easily be our problem. If the entity was going to get moved into high by someone other, yeah, so basically that is almost certainly where our problem comes from, right? So when the entity gets moved into its high frequency space, its velocity at that point, right, is going to basically be, excuse me. Its velocity at that point would get zeroed. So one question is there any way, right, that a sword could have that happen? It does seem like it would be possible for the sword to get placed down in low frequency, like it gets transitioned out of low frequency and then transitioned back into high frequency somehow or something like this, right? I don't think that's entirely out of the question, and so I assume that is exactly what happened. So let's take a look. Move entity. Let's see if we can actually make that happen. Force entity into high. So make entity high frequency. So one way we could do this to try and make that that case is we could go ahead and do an assert here, or rather we won't do an assertion. Let's just set a breakpoint, right? We'll set a breakpoint where if that entity low type equals a sword, then I'm going to set a breakpoint there, right? So if I'm looking at a sword, like so, break here, right, equals 5. So that way I can go ahead and just try to make that bug reproduce itself, and then I can also see, at that point, I'd be able to see the call stack to see who it was, exactly who was causing that to happen, right? So anyway, so yeah. So in this case, I think we're okay, because this should actually be called from game update and render, which is here. So it's gonna actually call that there, right? There we go. And then it gets called a second time. That seems erroneous, right? That doesn't seem right to me. Make entity high frequency. Why wasn't it high frequency already? What's going on here? Did it get moved out of the high frequency set? You saw it happen, didn't you? That seems erroneous to me. Let's see if that happens every time. That just seems bad. So let's go ahead and debug that. That seems like a bad situation. I don't think that should be happening. So basically, when we...
Kind of reminds me of that weird bug that is still probably hanging around in the whole spatial partitioning code, where when we first drop in, change entity location, when this is first called after dropping a player in, we are constantly flip-flopping between the first and second tile chunk X coordinates, and it just seems like intuitively it actually doesn't seem like it should be related, because it's not like the player was being moved in and out of high frequency over and over. Like, this should just never be happening more than once. Right? Because if there's already a high entity index on that low entity being stored, then, like, why in the heck should this ever be called again? Yeah, that's really weird.
You make entity high frequency, right? Make entity high frequency. There's two cases that's happening on the sword. One is happening when we're basically setting the camera, and so what we're doing is we're looping through everything and we're moving it here. So I'm guessing that what must happen is offset and check frequency by area must actually be removing the sword from the high frequency set for some reason, right? Because otherwise, why would that ever happen, right? So it must be the case that, like, our low P is judged as invalid or something weird happens. So I'm going to go ahead and say this right here is a case. Well, I guess I could do it in make entity low frequency, right? Low frequency. So in here, what I could do is say, okay, let's go ahead and see when we do this deletion. Yeah, so we just do this. If entity low, and we've got our type, and we want that to be the sword. Let's see who's moving that into the low frequency set, right? So that happens. And then, yeah, so something is amiss, in my opinion, because as you can see, we've hit this twice, but we never hit the, oh, no, that's not true. I lied. We actually have to set the breakpoint. Sorry about that. Spoke too soon. I was assuming that should fire, but it didn't, and I realized because I didn't actually set a breakpoint on it. All right, so there we go. That actually hits that breakpoint, which is what we expect, and then it hits this breakpoint. All right, so basically we've got nastiness, and that's good because now we can actually debug our nastiness, which is what we want. So the first time it enters into the high frequency set, that's exactly what we wanted to have happen, right? Because that's where we actually forced it into high, and that's where we actually set its state, right? And so that's all good, and off we go. Now the next time through, we find that we set it to low frequency, and the question is, why are we setting it to low frequency? Like, what's the reasoning, right, behind that? Of course, Microsoft Visual Studio makes it as hard as possible for that to happen by giving you absolutely no information whatsoever. What we'd like to be able to see is, like, what happened in here, but we can't, unfortunately.
It could be a thing. I'm just still thinking about this issue with the player spawning in and bouncing back and forth between tile chunks. What the heck did I do to my finger? Oh, that's right. That's old. Even though that bounce back and forth is happening, if it's happening multiple times in the same game loop iteration, just because of all the things that are unfolding over the course of a single game loop, it could be that he's, like, getting bounced out and then back in to high frequency, and that would explain why he's not, like, disappearing, before my eyes in the game. It's not really the same problem that he's addressing here. At least I don't think so. I don't think it's going to address that other problem that I still have not made the time to look into, because one thing at a time. You get the place where I'm trying to get to is not blocked by that issue. So, like, some sleeping dogs, you just have to leave them laying. So
And so what we want to do is say, all right, it failed one of these things. So let's see if we can figure out which one it failed. Yes, thank you so much, Visual Studio, for being absolutely awful at everything that you do. Okay, so let's go ahead and see if I can set the next statement to just be inside this routine. Actually, you know what I could do? Let me step out of this first. So let's go ahead and, well, you know what? This actually has the things I need in it to some degree, I suppose. Not really, because they're going to get deleted. Visual Studio. All right, well, let me see. I guess what I could do is trick Visual Studio into being less of the world's worst debugger, and maybe only the world's second worst debugger, by putting in some dummy line that will allow us to still inspect the variables we actually want to inspect. So here is our dummy line here, like so, and maybe this can help. As you know, people at Microsoft don't actually debug any of their code, so they don't actually have to worry about looking at code in the debugger, so it probably never occurred to them that people who actually do debug code and ship it without the bugs in it would want to actually see the variables in their code while they were stepping through it. That's kind of one of the things that debuggers sometimes do. But if you never launch a debugger and you just send it out the door however it is, you probably don't think about those things. Anyway, so let's see. We got our dummy line here, so now what I'm hoping to do is when I take a look at this make entity low frequency, I can now actually hopefully step out here, and since we've inserted this dummy line, I'll be able to actually look at these values, right? So there's the values that we actually have. Here's our high entity. Here's where he is. And he's set out in the middle of nowhere. That is pretty darn clear, right? So that's pretty telling. And the low position for him, not super sure I understand why he's set out in the middle of nowhere, but he is. And then his low position is actually doesn't seem to correlate with that at all to me, right? Am I wrong about that? But that seems fairly clear. So he's failing this, but I don't understand why he's getting these ridiculous values set. I'm not sure. I don't follow why that's the case. So I want to figure out what's going on there. In this set camera call, what is the entity offset per frame? Entity offset per frame is nothing. So that's, I guess, what to be expected. We're in this first game update and render through, so I don't know. That's pretty bizarre. Let's find out why that's happening. So when we first enter into the high space, where does the entity think it is? Entity high. Let's see here. And so moving into camera space, this is where it thinks it is, at 0, 0, right? That's where it's thinking the entity is at the moment. That's the camera space P, right? So let's get out of here and double check that. We've made the entity high frequency. Here it is. We set the low and the high there. So let's take a look here. Sword, like this. Let's see the low and the high, like so. So just taking a look here at these values, they all look very, very sane. Nothing particularly odd there. I will say, if that's the offset, -559, I am wondering a little bit, is that actually what it should be? Because I guess I don't know exactly where well, they might be that the camera's there as well. Let's double check to see what the camera state actually is, so you can see whether that's a sane value, right? Just want to make sure that that's actually makes sense. Yeah, so that's where the camera is. So that all worked out exactly as it should. And then we're going to come down here, and we're going to actually update the sword. So let's take a look at that call, because that's another thing that could do it. So if we take a look at our entity now, like so, there we go. Okay. So in here, in entity, we still have reasonable values for our high and our low values. And so I'm wondering how we end up with such ridiculous stuff. I'm guessing that something happens in here that causes that to occur. So let's take a look. So inside move entity, let's see what happens in there. When we do our movement, what's our DDP look like? It's all zeros. What's our new player P look like? Let's take a look at let's just take a look at what it's trying to do. New player P. That's a totally sane thing, as far as I can tell anyway. So the desired position. So let's take a look. What's that player delta? What's the team in? Yep. All looks pretty good. Nothing particularly out of the ordinary there, as far as I can tell anyway. Yeah. So entity high P is totally sane values. Totally sane values. So now let's take a look at what happens when we do our map into chunk space. When we map into chunk space, we get another totally sane value. So that seems reasonable as well. And then when we go ahead and do this, let's see what happens here. So we get our new P, our low NDP is going to get set. So there we go. And let's take a look at that. Low entity, like so. And that's totally fine as well. So coming out of here, this actually looks all pretty good, right? Nothing weird actually happened to our guy. So I'm not sure why we ended up with such ridiculous values there, but we did, unless that was just a trick of the debugger showing us wrong values, which could totally be the case, obviously. Let's go ahead and keep going with this investigation, because I'm not satisfied that we have any idea what's going on at this point. All right, so if I continue to look at my low entities, I could also look at my high entities.
It really is how it feels, and but I have no excuse, because I've done this before, and it annoys me that I can't figure out where this is going and where the issue is going to stem from. Ultimately, it bothers me, but you can't win them all. Victory, success, accomplishments are predicated upon many failures, right? So there you go.
I suppose. Here is the high index. It's high index 97. So what I could do is say, let's also take a look at it here. So what I want to do is say, I've got my game state. Oh! You know what? I don't think this has anything to do with it, but I just thought of something particularly ugly that we definitely probably, that's going to cause problems at some point. Although I don't know if...
I love the Eureka. By the way, it's not even a Eureka about the thing that we're dealing with right now.
if that some point is anywhere near now, but I just thought of something really gross. I don't even want to say it. It's so bad. The things I do for the stream. The things I do for the stream. All right. No, that's one off there. High entities is that like that? There we go. So this is our high entity, and we can delete all this stuff and just look at our high entity and our low entity for this guy, right? So here's our sword, our full description of the sword using totally hard offsets, so we can just kind of see as we go what's going to happen there.
Hold on. I just kind of noticed something that has been irritating me for a while now. I feel like I need to be down here because I'm constantly, along with the chat, blocking the watch window up there. So I'm gonna scoot myself over, and I don't know what to do about the chat. The chat can just kind of hover in the middle, I guess. I don't even know. Maybe yeah, we'll just kind of put it there and ever so slightly out of the way, like that. Of course, it shouldn't overlap Casey, so that's a problem. What if I just do that? Yeah, that's good.
So let's find out when that craziness actually occurs. Here's the drawing code. That's fine. So now we're going to have to step back into basically game update and render, right? Game update and render. So we're going to have to see coming through here. I assume we're still all good. We go through our controller index. We haven't done anything. So there's nothing weird that has to happen here. Let's see. We've got the low entities are fine. Yep, nothing weird there. Again, this is all fine. And our entity is still totally sane. It's not in its ridiculous state that it was. And so now when we come through here, and we're going to go ahead and do our set camera call, I assume this is where we get the weirdness, where the entity goes haywire, although I still have not been able to determine why that would happen. We're going to see if we can find it. So we get the camera bounds, we step into the frequency check, and then we're going to go through and start actually checking these, and we check them, and they probably should all be valid, I would say, right? I would think they'd all be valid. So I'm going to set a breakpoint at the end of this function, just let it run through there. And so it was able to go through that no problem. So that wasn't where we got made low frequency. So the first time through set camera was actually not a problem, which is kind of interesting, right? That's actually pretty unusual. Yeah, that's bizarre, but okay. So off we go. And then, so when we finally do it, I don't know how long it has been since that has happened. That's kind of weird, right? This happens at some point, but we're not really sure when. It's not in the first time we call offset and check frequency by area. It's in sometime quite thereafter. So I'm guessing that that might mean that it's only when we do that change location, because the change location call would cause that to happen. It looked like it was happening a lot faster than that, but I guess it wasn't. So if you remember, right, when we do our update, which is, it's right somewhere. Where is our update call? Update call. Update call. I wish I had a better way to jump to functions in here. I'm sure there must be one by now. I just don't know what it is in Visual Studio. So it must be that we're actually doing this, right? Oh, awesome. Man, I tell you, on stream I'm always so absent-minded. So we still left this in there. Why did I leave that in there? I said specifically that that was just a quick hack, and then like, here's the other thing we should do. And then there I go, like totally.
I even pointed this out, and I didn't, for whatever reason, connect the dots that might be related to the reason why. I mean, he had to go, what was that, like 20-something minutes trying to figure out what the issue was. But shame on me for not connecting the dots here. I wonder now if I re-enable that code, if I can recreate that bug. Yeah. Wow, that's something special. Well, let's never bring this up ever again. Let's never talk about that. Let's pretend that never happened.
Totally leaving it in there. Oh man, that's hilarious. Yeah, the number of typos I have on the stream is awful. I assume we've had some legitimate bugs so far, but man, the time I spend on the typos is way worse. I don't know. I kind of need, I need some kind of a thing for I got to figure out how I can talk and pay attention to my own code at the same time. I'm not really sure how to do that. Okay. let's get back to where we were before that ridiculousness. All right, so there's the high frequency, and there it goes. Man, that was so annoying. All right, so that's actually correct. That should be low frequency. So that's fine. I want to see if I can repair that bug again without that ridiculous being in there, just so I can, because that was probably the entirety of the bug. So lame. Yeah. So there's one thing that we are doing at the moment, though, that's a little annoying, which is I feel like, I don't know exactly how I was able to do that, but that's pretty cool. We don't actually ensure that we set the position back to where it was, so I'm actually able to do kind of a cool hookshot thing here sometimes, like right there. So that means, basically, if you look at the order, it's kind of interesting. So this is something that we've been needing to do for a while, and that's the first time we've actually had this happen. So if you think about the order of operations here, everyone's getting updated in a particularly coherent way, except for this ridiculousness. This is totally outside of we update the player inside this this thing where we're processing the input in a way that doesn't actually ensure that things that should have happened to the sword, for example, actually have happened to the sword already. So the set camera call, for example, hasn't happened, which means that you could, if you wanted to, end up getting the low entity of the sword and having the low sword's P be not valid, right? But it still wouldn't actually be outside of the high entity set, right? Because it hadn't got moved out of there yet, which means that its position in high entity space, this wouldn't actually trigger anything, right? Which wouldn't restore its position. I know this is a particularly weird thing to think about, but basically, you can think of this as a bug in one of two different ways. One is that the order of operations is odd, and that's something that we have to sort of work out because we kind of have this done piecemeal here. So one thing that we do kind of want to do is collect our user input, and then we want to update the player in a coherent way outside here, right? So that's one thing. The other thing that we want to be able to do is when we change a location, we kind of have this problem where if you change a location and the entity has a representation in high space, we want those to stay in sync. And right now, those can easily get out of sync. And so the question is, how do we design our system so that those don't get out of sync, right? And that's kind of a tricky problem. Again, this is the reason why I'm trying to do having two different sets of entity updates, is because you can see it's a lot more complicated to write the code this way than it would be if we didn't do this. And so I'm trying to, whenever I can, I'm trying to pick the most complicated type of thing you might have to do and do it that way, to show how you work through all of the problems that are involved in it, right? Because I want to show how you can make any systems that scale up to huge numbers of entities. Even if we could save a lot of time by not doing that, I don't really want to go that route. So I would rather spend the time figuring out exactly how to work through those things. So there you go. So I think that's what we want to probably focus on next time. I would say that's going to be our to-do for tomorrow, is to sort of, okay, now that we have a real, relatively complicated situation happening here, where we can see the consequence of things, I would say tomorrow's goal is to pull out this code and streamline it so that we can have a sane system for dealing with positions where we're not going to get bugs in terms of things moving in and out of the high entity set like that. Like, what can we do to basically increase the usability of that system? So I'm going to put a to-do in here, for tomorrow. Basically, what we're going to do is say, now that we have some real usage examples, let's solidify the positioning system. Okay. And that'll be fine for you tomorrow. So let's go ahead and go to the Q&A. Please prefix your questions with Q:, so I will see them.
Okay, so that's that. Pretty easy day yet again for me, since Casey just had to debug an issue, which I totally should have caught that. I mean, I've caught things like that before and been like, I think this is going to be an issue later on. But this was like the most egregious one because he had to spend so long to get to that point where he was like, oh, I didn't actually, where was that? Change, pull out that wild, change the player's high entity position here. So clearly it had absolutely nothing to do with that issue that I was talking about, which is still certainly an issue that I should spend some time looking into. And I don't think I have a to-do. It was something about bouncing, yeah. It would be like after add player is called initially, and then what is it down here is where we move it. Like the issue was specifically after the player gets added, it is somehow then let's see here, because change entity location is called in here, right? Yeah, to be fair, we could have made a change that actually got rid of that issue. I haven't bothered to look at it to see, so I won't add it to do. especially because it's not visibly causing any bugs. It's just a weird thing where, like, until we actually move the player around after they're spawned in, we're just constantly updating the chunk space that he occupies somehow, and it's being changed incorrectly. But at that point in time, there was a bunch of other things that I was that I had fixed in the code. So I don't know. It's just a really weird issue that doesn't seem worth doing anything about at this point. I didn't realize I wasn't on my editor there, so that sucks. But yeah, right in here, right? Somehow it's related to the code that we were looking at today, in that it should be that the old position and new position are in the same chunk. But because the chunk X is flip-flopping after the player drops in, right? And it's just really weird because I don't see it as an actual issue. What the hell was that about? Just randomly wouldn't compile and run. So like until we move a chunk over, right, which would be like at this point, the chunk X on that player entity is just messed up. So I don't know. At some point, I really need to look into it. I don't know. It's kind of a non-issue, but it indicates that there's something. There's a learning opportunity there, and it's just about taking the time to go and do it. So I would like to stick around for the Q&A, but got to go run an errand again. So I'm going to drop off here, and we'll come back tomorrow for day 63, where we will talk about simulation regions, which means we're getting into kind of a new sort of domain of engine programming, a little bit, kind of, that is like very much a kind of culmination of all the things that have been worked on over the past few weeks. So I'm a little bit fuzzy on like the notion of it, you know, like what motivates breaking some of this code out into like a simulation, because he winds up, I'm pretty sure, adding like a whole sim file or sim region file, something like that. But we'll get there when we get there, which will be tomorrow. So thanks for hanging out with me for another stream of Odinmade Hero, and I'll see you in the next one. So have a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you then. Peace out.